You can order a videotaped copy of any of tonight's American Perspectives events by going online to the bottom of cspan.org's homepage and clicking on C-SPAN Store. Or call C-SPAN Archives toll-free weekdays at 1-877 on C-SPAN. That's 1-877-662-7726. American Perspectives continues now on this 40th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination. The late Dr. James Carrico was one of the Parkland Hospital surgeons who tried to save President Kennedy's life. In 1997, he took part in an oral history project conducted by the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. This is the first time this interview has ever been shown on television.
Do you recall when you heard or any thoughts you might have had about him coming to Dallas on a political trip?
I knew he was coming, but there was a lot of, as I'm sure you're aware, really negative statements in the paper about Kennedy and some real hateful stuff in the paper. And we were aware of that, and I thought that was, at the time, I didn't think that was going to help anybody. I didn't have any real thoughts about his coming or any concept
Did that
of danger.
cause, at the hospital, I guess particularly since this was a place where someone who would, what happened would naturally be brought, was there any advanced preparation in any way, just a contingency plan if something happened while the president was in the city?
No, as a matter of fact, one of the big differences in then and now is not only the hospital's preparation, but the Secret Service preparation for presidential visits. At that time, there hadn't been a president assassinated in probably 50 years. I don't know the exact time. And it never really seriously occurred to anybody that the president would actually be harmed, at least to anybody I knew.
You don't know? Oh, go ahead.
As you're well aware, right now, when a president visits any city, the Secret Service precedes him. They select the hospital where he'll go. They select the physician. A whole situation set up. His medical records are made available. He's followed by a paramedic van, etc. In 1963, there was, as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure I know this, no pre-planning. The reason they came to Parkland was simply because they're headed that way, and that's where all the injured patients went. There was no selection of hospital or letting us know his blood type or anything else. So
the Secret Service did not, while they had been around town,
I'm sure, yes, I'm confident they've been
with the parade route and the luncheon arrangements and all this.
Sure.
As far as you know, they never came to
as far as I know, there were no
any of the
hospital arrangements, and certainly there was no information provided about the president's health status or anything like that.
Well, zeroing in on the day of November 22nd, 1963, can you kind of reconstruct your day for us? And were you at the hospital overnight? Did you get up that morning? Were you?
Right. I don't remember the early morning. I was actually assigned to Surgery C, which is an elective surgery service, and it was our day to admit patients. So we came in. I'm confident we came in early that morning and made rounds. It was also our clinic day. We didn't operate that day. We had our basically office. So we early in the morning, probably 8:30 or 9, went over to our clinic and started seeing patients, both patients we'd operated on and patients who were being evaluated for new operations. About 11:30, we were getting pretty close to through with our clinic, and we got a call from the emergency room that there were 3 patients down there to be evaluated for admission. This was not President Kennedy. These were 3 patients who had come to Parkland for care. And somebody needed to go down. One of our service needed to go down and start seeing those patients and evaluating them. We also had scheduled a special X-ray where a patient we thought had blood clots in his lungs, and somebody had to go down and participate in doing that X-ray study. The X-ray study sounded like a whole lot more fun than working up 3 patients. So Jerry Gustafson, who was a year ahead of me in the program, and I flipped, and he won the coin flip. He had the privilege of going to do the X-ray study, and I went down to the emergency room to start evaluating the patients that we were going to end up admitting. So that's how I got down to the emergency room.
That's why you were there an hour later, I guess,
Right.
about 12:30.
Just about 12:30, yeah.
Did you recall having any thoughts or any discussion about, oh, gee, you were missing the parade or anything like that, or is that just, you know?
We didn't. The only comment I made, I remember, and I'm not sure if I remember it or I remember Dr. Jenkins talking about it, is Dr. Jenkins commented on the president being in town and hoped everything went well.
So, do you remember sort of exactly how you first heard, what you were doing at the time? A dispatch came in some way?
We were, again, I may be telling you more than you want to hear.
No, we want to hear it all.
The other thing which is different, we talked about how different things are.
Yes.
Right now, as you know, there are mobile intensive care units, really paramedic equipped vans, EMSs, who pick up injured patients, pick up ill patients. They have direct radio communications with the hospitals. We know what's coming. We can actually help direct their care before the patients get here. In '63, none of that existed. I mean, that all started really about '69. Dallas really did have a very sophisticated system for the time, but it consisted of some of the ambulances having radios which connect with the police dispatcher, and the police dispatcher would then call the hospital and say, you know, X patients are coming. There was frequently some confusion in all that communication with several people. So a lot of times we got a call from the police dispatcher which turned out to be false alarm or overstated. So that leads up to what happened then. One of the nurses came out and told Richard Delaney, who was actually in charge of the emergency room that day, that she had just got a call from the police dispatcher and the president had been shot and was on his way to the hospital.
Only the president?
That was the
first
message I remember. President's been shot, it's on his way to the hospital. I mean, the obvious question is what do you do? Well, first thing you do is you don't want to believe it. You know, and with all the misinformation that happened in a situation like that, it was easy to say, yeah, it must be wrong, and it can't be right. But the other thing you do is you start getting ready. So the nurses paged the appropriate people to come help take care of an injured patient. And they paged the surgery team, the rest of the surgery team on call. The chief resident, who was Ron Jones, who's now chief of surgery at Baylor.
Yeah, anyone you can identify by name would be helpful.
Yeah, Malcolm Perry, who was the attending on call that day. Dr. Tom Shires, who was the chief of surgery, he was actually in Galveston giving a paper, but obviously the people in the emergency room didn't know that. But basically, they paged the whole resuscitation team. And we hoped it wasn't we hoped very much it was a false alarm, right? We also were, you know, there's always a risk that you're going to be calling a false alarm. Anyway, it seemed like 2 or 3 minutes after we got the message that the door to the emergency room came open and a patient was rolled in, that was Governor Connolly, as a matter of fact. And the reason Governor Connolly was brought in first, I believe, is because he was sitting in the jump seat.
Well, that's the explanation. They had to remove him before the...
Right, so they had to get the governor out of the way, and they brought him in first. So we looked at Governor Connolly, and he had a large wound in the front of his chest and was actually unconscious from the abnormal breathing that results from that large wound. We knew he was hurt badly. We figured we could treat him if that was all was wrong, and we also knew it wasn't the president. It didn't occur to either Delaney or I who it was. We were only interested in who it wasn't.
Yes.
And it was not the president. So we kind of heaved this great sigh of relief and said, you know, maybe it's a Secret Service man, but we'll take care of him. And so we rolled him into trauma room 2, which is really the biggest trauma room. And
Did that cause you to divide your team up in any sense in terms of expertise?
Not really, because I mean the beauty of Parkland then and now is the contingency. I mean you start out, you have a team, but you have tremendous backup, and so you can always get more help and expertise. I guess nothing's always, but you can handle an immense amount of work when you need to.
Yeah.
But basically, Delaney and I both went in the room with him. We knew the rest of the support was on the way. The way you treat a wound like that is you plug the hole. Basically, when you breathe, air normally goes in here. If you got a hole this big, air goes in there. So you plug that hole.
Seeing that part.
And
Okay.
you plug that hole, and then the air starts going in the right way, and the governor started waking up. So about that time, another patient was rolled into trauma room 1, and Delaney and I kind of looked at each other, and I'm not sure how we decided, but basically we decided Delaney would stay with the governor, and I'd go see about the patient in the other room. And that's how I ended up being in the president's room.
And in that room, do you recall at that time, who was there exactly when?
Mrs. Kennedy was kind of standing by the door. My recollection is there were 2 men in the room, and I assume they were the driver or Secret Service people. They very rapidly stepped aside when we came in. And
did Miss Kennedy speak to you, or either of these people?
I don't recall any spoken interchange. I think
they were getting out of your way.
They clearly saw we were coming in to take care of things, and Miss Kennedy, as I recall, stood by the door for a long time, and the two gentlemen, I never saw them again that I recognized.
From this point, probably you're going to need as much as you can to give us sort of specific descriptions that a medical professional would recognize, and then maybe also the kind of lay person, like what you saw, how you approached the problem, who was doing what.
Okay. The people that were there were, that I remember, and I'm sure there were others, were myself, a nurse, Diane Bowren, B-O-W-R-E-N, I think, and 2 interns. Marty White, who's now head of the organ bank here in Dallas. There's a lot of people still around, and an oral surgery resident whose name I don't remember right now, oral surgery intern. So that was the team. Your job in a patient who's severely injured, it kind of goes in the steps of do what it takes to keep the patient alive, then you go back and evaluate the injuries more detail and kind of make your long-term plan. And the keeping alive, first you got to have way to breathe. Second, you got to be breathing. Third, your heart's got to be pumping. And fourth, your head's got to be working. Your nervous system's got to be working. So your job is exactly that. You see what's going on with the airway, you see what's going on with breathing, you see what's going on with the circulation, and then you look at neurological function. Usually one person kind of takes charge and everybody else, one team gets some IVs going to support circulation. The nurse kind of gets the patient undressed and keeps things flowing. And that's pretty much what we did. Dr. Marty White and the other intern started doing a cut down on the president's right ankle, I think. Cut down is where you start an IV by actually making an incision and putting a little tube in the vein, or a big tube in the vein, so you can give a lot of blood and fluid if you need to. Diane and I looked at the president overall, saw that he was not breathing. He was breathing very erratically. Call it agonal respiration. It's kind of gasping.
He was. The impression was that he was not dead at this point. He was dead at this point. Or you do this anyway.
Yeah. Well, we looked at him and he still had some breathing. He still had some heartbeat. He had a terrible looking wound, but that wound you kind of really defer to later in terms of evaluating in detail. The principle is, if you got somebody who's got what looks like a terrible injury and his did, first thing you do is you do the things I talked about. You get the airway going, you get them breathing, then you have time to evaluate the extent of the injury. I've told folks before that the thoughts that I remember going through my head, takes longer to describe them than it took to have them, were first, presidents had it. I mean, he's not going to make it. And that was right. Second is, we got to do something. That was the political, the medical thoughts. You know, we can't just let the president die. Third thought was, gosh, what if we get him alive and then he's a vegetable? And the rational thought was, treat this patient like anybody else. Get his airway under control, get him breathing, get his circulation going. Then you can decide about all that other situation. So that's what we did.
Well, you obviously must have really felt, being aware as the president, a sense of responsibility. Were you thinking in terms of history, or just, gosh, this is... I guess
this
is on my shoulders, or
those brief thoughts, and they, you know, it took a long time to say them. It took about that long to have them. Were the non-medical thoughts, if you will. You know, I mean, I guess my major thoughts were, you know, I really didn't think about the historical impact. What's that's going to do? I said, well, our job is to take care of the president, and that's we got kind of the reputation of medicine and everything else on our back for a second there. And then that's when the rational thoughts took over and says, okay, we know how to do this. I mean, whether this is the president or whoever, we know how to take care of this guy. And so it became pretty much unemotional and not automatic, but dispassionate at that point.
Professional aspect kicked in, as it did, I think, with law enforcement agents
Sure.
and reporters and everything.
Right. So there was that short, personal, emotional, what am I going to do feeling, and then the professional aspect, as you say, kicked in, and you know what to do, and that's what you're trained to do.
Okay, so kind of go ahead from this
Okay,
point.
so the procedure then is to first see if the president's has an airway, and he really didn't. When we looked at him, he had, we saw this wound up here in the side of his head. Great big wound.
That was readily apparent.
Oh, yeah.
He was laying on his back.
Laying on his back, and
Came in, and
that was obvious.
would this be the point you want to kind of illustrate that in terms
Sure.
of where on his head, and if it's
Yeah.
what did you see?
That's fine. It can. It's kind of out of order medically, but it's probably in
Okay.
order forensically.
Okay.
Yeah. What I remember, and I was telling Dr. Montgomery earlier, with the president laying on his back, I could see the whole wound in his head, and that's important because that really doesn't fit perfectly what we wrote down later. So that meant it had to be in the. Well, it was about right here, as I recall, and about as big as I'm showing with my hand. About, you know, a big chunk of bone and scalp missing. And the fact that you could see all of it from the front meant that it involved the parietal bone, which is this big skull bone, and the temporal bone, which is this big skull bone. So we saw that hole. We saw he had a little hole right.
Was that about another sort of controversial thing? Was this above his collar line or slightly below it?
By the time
What do you call it
I
about
looked,
that?
Diane, the nurse, had started taking his clothes off, which was her job.
Yes.
So I really don't know
You don't know
whether it
exactly
was
what
through the
that
collar
was.
or not, but it was certainly at the collar line. It was just about right there, just to the right of the trachea, and just certainly where his collar should have been.
And she was the one that removed the tie, as far as you know, or
Yeah, I mean,
I think it was cut off. Is that right?
That's correct.
Would that be
Normal,
standard?
absolutely.
Normal?
Yeah,
Absolute normal?
I was doing other stuff. I was
Yes.
looking his head and stuff, and Diane was doing that. But what you normally do is just take scissors right there, or right
okay.
there. So that both gets the collar and the tie beside the knot, and then you just go right on down, take the shirt off, and then you can see the patient's chest and breathing and all that. So that's Diane Bowen was doing that while I was actually trying to evaluate what we're going to do. I think I just messed up your microphone, did I?
You getting it okay? Yeah,
Okay.
all right.
Anyway, so the next thing, since he really wasn't breathing very well, the next thing to do was try to get him breathing better. And that involved putting in an endotracheal tube, which is
Yes.
a tube which goes through the mouth, down into the windpipe, and you can breathe through. So we got that done, and at that time we could see that there was some blood beside the larynx, which is down deep in the throat.
Oh,
It
okay,
was from
but we're
inside.
along about here?
Yeah, well, that would be inside. You actually take
okay.
you take a lighted instrument and you look down and see the windpipe inside at the bottom of the throat, and then you put a tube in it. When I looked down there, I could see that there was some bruising and some abnormal swelling over to the right side of the windpipe, and we were able to slip the tube into his trachea and should have been able to breathe better at that point.
That head wound, which you're well aware of, been such a point of controversy and various interpretations and so forth. Did you have any impression at that point, say the direction was a shot that came from the front, from the rear, or just?
No, I mean, the two answers to that. Really didn't, and that's not what you think about at a time like that, although obviously you can't separate thoughts that much. The other is that wound certainly, this wound certainly looked like an exit wound. I mean, just because things were just really blown away.
Okay. Exit towards the back, you're saying?
No,
or
just out.
Just out.
It looks like, I mean, you got wounds that go in, wounds that go out. This was an out.
I
Okay,
see.
and that was the what it looked like. But there was nothing about it that would say whether the entrance had come from the front or from the back.
I see.
But this looked like where a bullet went out.
I see. Well, once again, I might emphasize, now this was really, in a sense, routine. This team worked with these kind of emergencies every day, right?
Correct.
And so that aspect of it was not that unusual for you.
Correct.
Okay.
And also the order of things. So you try to keep the patient alive, you try to treat their wounds, and then in the patients where you're not successful, then we would work with the medical examiner to try to help them figure out the forensics. They were really the forensic experts. We provided the clinical information.
And sort of, as much as we can, clarify the two wounds. Did you ever determine exactly in your own mind where the shoulder or neck wound, and just recently now something's come out about Gerald Ford, who's on the Warren Commission, slightly altering a description there that's kind of
Right.
stirred the issue again.
Sure. The simple answer is the only wounds I saw, the only wounds we saw, were this wound here and this big hole here. We never saw the wounds in the president's back. And the medical process is we got his airway going, then we hooked him up to the ventilator and we're trying to help him breathe. Then you got to answer, how's his breathing going? And to answer that, you got to ask, are there any major holes in his chest wall like the governor had in his chest wall, which would impair his breathing. So you don't always roll the patient over to look at that, particularly in the situation we were in. You don't roll them over. You just put your hands behind the patient's back, down about the belt, and then kind of move up, feeling, to try to make sure that the body cavities are intact. And in doing that, did not detect any big holes, and obviously didn't see what apparently turned out to be two small wounds, one kind of over the shoulder and one back here, way back in the lower back of the head. So we never saw those two wounds in the back. And that's the long answer to a short question.
No, well, we probably need long answers to almost all the questions in that sense.
And the reason we didn't is that was, at least at that point, that was not part of the appropriate medical exam, to try to find. That would actually required rolling the patient over, washing blood off, etc. And clearly in somebody that you're struggling to keep alive, you don't do that.
Is there anything else we need to fill in here before, say, the point where it was determined he was dead or declared dead, and who called that shot?
Not really, or we can fill, I mean, there's some medical stuff which we could fill in briefly. After we got the tube in, tried to breathe for him, he still wasn't breathing very well. And his heart rate was slowing down, and his heart actually stopped. When his heart stopped, By that time, Dr. Perry, Dr. Jones, Dr. Jenkins, Dr. Giesecke, the assistant chief of anesthesia, Dr. Baxter, a number of people were there. They started CPR. Because there was concerns about whether he had tension pneumothorax or not, and we hadn't had time to get an x-ray, they actually put chest tubes in both chests. Those are things so if you do have a collapsed lung, it can expand it and you can breathe. Concern about whether or not the endotracheal tube was actually where it should be because of the tracheal wound. So Dr. Perry did a tracheostomy, which is where you make an incision in the neck to get a shorter tube in more directly into the trachea, so there's no question it's in place. And I guess all that is important in terms of
certainly
explaining what was done, and a lot of things that happened in that 20 minutes. As I'm sure you're aware, the tracheostomy wound was right through this wound in the neck, and that caused some confusion later. But that's where tracheostomy wound had to be. Then we gave him some steroids because we had remembered from some stuff in the press that he probably had abnormal adrenal glands. And,
but you've already covered this, and since you talked about the Secret Service, you didn't have his medical record there. And,
that's correct.
On hand as you would have today.
Correct. So at this point we had gotten his airway under control, gotten him breathing, trying to make his circulation better. His circulation wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. His heart had stopped. But we'd done all we could do to get things stable. Kemp Clark, who is the chief of neurosurgery, evaluated the situation, evaluated the head wound in much more detail than I did. And then Kemp Clark was the one the chief of neurosurgery was the one that actually pronounced him dead.
And this was some 20 minutes later?
About, yeah.
Something like that?
Something like that.
The priest had come in?
Actually, Dr. Clark said, he basically said it's time to stop the resuscitation. He would, for whatever reason, the decision made not to actually pronounce the president dead until after the priest had come in and given him the last rites. So we stopped treatment, but Dr. Clark didn't pronounce him until after the last rites.
Do you recall who notified Mrs. Kennedy? Was that one of the medical team, or did you?
I don't know.
Don't recall that?
No.
And so from that point, what happened?
Well, from that point, my job was, the medical part, I guess the patient care part of my job was over. Had two things to do. One is we had to as we do for all patients, write a brief report in the emergency room records of the treatment and what we saw and what we did. And my other job was to find those three patients who I had been working on before the president came in and take care of them. We did sit down. I remember one thing, which probably of note. Walked out of the trauma room 1 and been to the big emergency room, which 20 minutes before had been a big city-county emergency room full of people being treated, etc. All the patients were gone when I walked out. They'd been moved elsewhere. The people in the room were by and large men with coats off, shirts and ties on, and guns on their hip. And a couple were talking on the phone to Washington, and that's when I guess really the whole thing kind of hit me. You know, it just up till then, except for that brief moment, it had been professional work. And I walked there and realized that not only had my little world changed, but the whole world had changed, and it changed that quick. So that I was smoked at that time, as a lot of us did. We thought it was a cute thing to do, right? So I started to light a cigarette. And imagine lighting a cigarette in an emergency room now, but that was common in 1963. So I started to light a cigarette and realized I was trembling so that I really couldn't had trouble getting the match to the cigarette. But kind of got that under control and sat down to write my recollections, and again,
This was just individually, was not the team, or
no, each physician writes their own report independently. There's no proscription against exchanging information, and you know, I mean, I'm sure you could ask the guy next to you, where was that wound, what was involved, and I remember we did. I do not remember if we did that or not, but we wrote our records. And
also kind of thinking in terms of any conversation you might have had about the effect on others, is that being part of that process. Did y'all talk about it later, if not then, or?
You mean just how everybody was dealing with it?
Yeah, how it affected you personally.
Yeah. I'm sure we talked about it some, but we didn't talk about it as a group, and there was none of the debriefing which would happen now. But it was, we just kind of went back to work. I mean, we finished writing our reports. As you know, by the time we finished writing our reports, they had taken the president's body away, so our reports did not get to Bethesda for time for the autopsy.
What do you know about that issue? There's a big conflict about removing the body. State law, the autopsy should have been done here. At the time, did that seem significant to you, that what happened, that it was removed?
No, I was a little surprised in a professional sense, and kind of in this sense. As I said, what would usually have happened with a patient who came in and died of a gunshot wound is we would have tried to keep him alive. We'd have done whatever we had to do medically. We probably would have spent more time after the patient was dead kind of trying to figure out the forensics ourselves than we did with the president, but it didn't seem appropriate to do that with the president. But it really wouldn't have mattered, because when Earl Rose, who was the new county medical examiner, did his autopsy, if he had questions about the treatment, he would call us. Matter of fact, he'd frequently call us down just to teach us. He'd call the house staff and say, okay, here's this patient you treated, tell me what you did, and let me show you how to recognize exit wounds, entrance wounds, etc. So we kind of all assumed that there was no reason to roll the president over, that Earl Rose would be doing the autopsy. When the president was taken away, we realized, gee, the body's gone, Earl's not going to do the autopsy, and these guys are not going to have any medical records to go by. But that was kind of the medical surprise, if you will. Didn't think about why they would have done that.
It wasn't related to his competency as a or anything like that?
No, zero. I mean, Earl Rose was and I think is still recognized as one of the really outstanding forensic pathologists in the country. But the reason we're given, and it makes sense, is that President Johnson was not willing to leave Dallas on Air Force One, President Kennedy's plane, without President Kennedy's body.
So you think it was probably his decision as opposed to Mrs. Kennedy, or the two of you don't?
I really don't know.
Supposition on your part.
Yeah. What I've heard is
yes,
that President Johnson wouldn't leave without President Kennedy's body, and I don't know any facts, but it makes sense. I mean, he was a pretty shrewd politician, and you can imagine the impact of people saying, boy, he not only took the president's job, he took his plane, he left town, left the president in this mess.
Well, I recall in the interview we did with Henry Wade, who was the district attorney at the time, and just kind of dismissed that as, he said, well, the only fine was $100 if you removed the body from the state of Texas. It was not that big a deal from that point of view.
No, I mean, the law is, as I understand it, that a murder here, the examination has to be done here. But gosh, it was a president. There's no laws about shot presidents, and it's no big. I mean, if I'd have been a Secret Service man, I think I'd done the same thing. I'd gotten that body out of here and gotten President Johnson out of here, because they didn't know if it was this was a Russian plot. They didn't know what was going on. So their job was to get Johnson to safety.
When the autopsy was performed, the information that came back to, to you or to Dallas, however that came about, what was your reaction then? Do you remember?
Well, the first, we had, Friday night had been busy with taking care of those 3 patients that were waiting, and that.
Well, I want to get the details of that weekend too, but
sure.
just kind of while we're on this subject.
Saturday morning was our mortality and morbidity conference. Every Saturday morning we sat down and went through all the cases we'd done during the week, and anything that had gone wrong, we analyzed what had gone wrong, and which is a fairly typical medical approach to things. So we were in our Saturday morning conference when the phone rang, and it was the pathologist in Bethesda trying to get hold of Dr. Malcolm Perry to get some medical information. And that was the first time, I think, that the pathologist in Bethesda knew that there was a wound here, because all they saw apparently was a hole here, a little hole here, a big hole here, and a tracheostomy wound. And since they didn't have any medical records, they couldn't figure out how in the world 3 holes connected. So they called Malcolm, and that's when they told him that there was, that these other 2 wounds were there. And that's when it kind of began to make sense that bullet went in here, came out here, nicked his trachea, maybe he hurt his spinal cord, didn't kill him. And then the second bullet went in here, hit the bones inside his head, but came out here and blew that big hole. And so that was the first time we could really put things together in a way that made sense.
And what you were hearing from them and after those discussions, they did make sense to you?
Yes.
Excuse me.
Because before we had seen this hole and this hole, didn't know whether there were holes back here or not, and we were trying to speculate how these 2 could connect, and that was hard to make any sense out of that.
What about also the controversy about the bullet that went through President Kennedy, went into Governor Connally? Out of your experience with other gunshot wounds and everything, is this feasible to you?
Yes, it is. There's been a lot of analysis on that on both sides, and haven't looked into it in detail, but certainly the concept that a bullet, this first bullet, went through here and really hit very little other than muscle in the side of the trachea, which is soft, then went into Governor Connally's back, and the first time it really discharged a lot of his energy was coming out to his chest here. Then I guess it hit his right or left wrist, I forgot. It must have been his right wrist, and hurt the bone. But it really, if you look, that wasn't a terrible destructive wound like this thing was, and then kind of splatted into his thigh. That sounds like a lot of traveling for a bullet, but it's certainly plausible. I mean, bullets do strange things. And that was unlike some of the movie suggesting it bounced all over the place. That was pretty much a straight line.
You were in that first room working with Dr. Delaney.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever realize it was Connally in there?
Not until later. I mean.
So you left that room to go to the next body, and you didn't know it was the governor.
Right.
When did you realize it was Kennedy in the other room?
Oh, as soon as I walked in the door, because that's who we were looking for. Right. I mean, what's the old story? You see what you're looking for.
Uh-huh.
We were looking for the president. Connally wasn't him, and I got to say this very carefully. It didn't really matter who that was, did it? In terms of treating him, we were going to treat him the same no matter who. And then when I walked in the room and saw the president, it was obvious it was him, because that was what the tapes were running to look for, and of course he was very recognizable.
Tell us a little bit about the Addison's disease and what was out in the medical community and what you knew about it.
Yeah. Well, what I know in retrospect, at least what I believe, is that President Kennedy had had some severe arthritis, etc., and had been put on steroids for pain relief or for relief of inflammation. And when you put people on big doses of steroids long enough, it actually, the adrenal glands quit responding. And apparently his adrenal glands had quit responding. Whether he had had any primary problem with his adrenals, I guess we'll never know, because apparently they were not part of the autopsy. But the way we kind of had some hint that something was going on, as I say, we were aware of all the noise in the press, or some of the noise in the press. Somewhere in Congress within a few months before the president's assassination, there had been a discussion where somebody had said that the president had Addison's disease, and Bobby Kennedy had said, Addison's disease is caused by tuberculosis. My brother's never had tuberculosis, therefore my brother doesn't have Addison's disease. Well, the logic is there, but the logic to a country boy is that that's a little evasive, right? And so was kind of common knowledge that the president had adrenal insufficiency. Well, that had been in the
press. I can recall that.
Yeah.
Yes, those rumors.
So those rumors that he had adrenal insufficiency were around, and so that was we happen to remember that, and so we gave him steroids, hydrocortisone, early in his treatment. Normally, you would not do that to somebody who was in shock, but if their adrenal glands weren't working, you would. So that's
but actually, tuberculosis is not. Addison's disease and tuberculosis are not connected.
Well, medicine's funny business. See, there are. I know you guys, we're tape's running short. There's physiologic diagnosis, adrenal insufficiency. Okay, that means adrenals aren't working. Then we sometimes name diseases, right? Addison's disease is named after Dr. Addison. And Dr. Addison described adrenal insufficiency in people who had tuberculosis and destroyed their adrenal glands. So literally speaking, Addison's disease is adrenal insufficiency caused by tuberculosis. And literally speaking, President Kennedy did not have Addison's disease, but he still had adrenal insufficiency. See the difference? It's eponyms versus physiologic description.
I've heard that had you not done that, had you not given him those injections for that Addison's disease, that even if you had saved him, he would have had problems.
Well, what probably would have happened if he really had adrenal insufficiency, and we think he did, that he never would have responded to the shock. He never would have come out of shock, or at least it would have been much more difficult to get his circulation going. Because what the adrenals do when you get stressed is they kick out cortisone and other things which help your body respond. So it would have made it much more difficult for him to come out of shock. But had he lived over it, then he would have still needed steroids long term. But there would have been no injury, any organ injury from not getting the steroids. But they would have been important to getting him to survive.
And you've been a little modest. It really was you who remembered this.
That
Team.
Yeah, but that's what a team's about. Right? And everybody pitches in, and actually he would have gotten him anyway, because Admiral Berkeley came in late in the resuscitation, carrying vials of hydrocortisone to make sure the president got them. He had, again, his car had been separated.
Who was Admiral?
Admiral Berkeley was the president's personal physician.
Was traveling with him. Yes.
Traveling with him, but he was 2 or 3 cars back, so they got separated in the traffic, etc., or in all the melee. And
well,
so,
I think the rest of the motorcade diverted to the trade center.
Yes, yeah.
So and then people had to scramble to get over to the hospital.
So it took him. I know it was late in the resuscitation when he came and said, "Give the president hydrocortisone," but then it was too late, but then we'd already given it. But
so he was pleased to note that you.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
One of the other issues with some of the conspiracy theorists relates to how his body was removed from Parkland, and question about a switch of a body bag or something.
Right.
You know anything about that at all?
I really don't. I mean, I just
You were not in the room when he
wasn't in the room when he left. I wasn't even aware that when he left. I was just aware that he had left. There's one thing which Dr. Montgomery and I were talking about, which is an inaccuracy in our records, which
Well, let's clarify that. That was kind of the next step in this,
Okay.
was for you to add anything we haven't touched on, certainly.
If you look at what we wrote, we said that the scalp wound was occipital parietal, which would, and the occipital bone is way back in the back, and the parietal bone's here. Again, those notes were written after the president had gone. We were kind of trying to remember. And it didn't occur to us that this was a big forensic record we were writing. We thought we were writing a medical record. So, you know, could have said head wound, that would have been a lot better. If the occipital bone's way back here and the president's laying on that, you couldn't see the whole wound, right?
And that's, could you kind of turn your head
Yeah.
and kind of show?
Matter of fact, there's a little
okay.
knot on the back of your head,
okay.
and that's kind of where the occipital bone reaches its peak, right in the middle. Everybody's a little knot on the back of their head.
Okay.
So occipital parietal would have really been right back there. And literally speaking, number one, that would have been very difficult to explain as a exit wound if you were shot from the back. And number two, you couldn't have seen it with the patient lying on his back on a gurney. So if the recollection that we could see the whole wound from the front's accurate, and I think it is, then what we should have written down was temporal parietal rather than occipital parietal. Part of that is learning through the years that a medical record is much more than a medical record. It becomes a forensic record. Sometimes it's a billing record. So that I wish we'd have been more precise in our writing. We weren't.
Tonight on American Perspectives, we're looking back at the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which happened on this day 40 years ago. The next oral history interview is from Malcolm Kilduff, the assistant White House press secretary who traveled with President Kennedy to Dallas and announced his death to the public. The sixth-floor museum at Dealey Plaza provided us with this interview, never before seen on television.
Had you traveled with the president, say, prior to the trip to Texas?
Oh yeah, I
that
had
sort
done
of-
most of the from the time I first went to the White House,
Okay.
and even before I went to the White House in '61, I did some advanced him in London, and then I advanced him in Ireland and in Italy, and I advanced him in, I forgot how many of the states, but in every state that he went to after '62, in the congressional campaign of 1962, which of course bumped into the Cuban Missile Crisis in October, but I did all those states. And,
But when you say advance, it sounds like to me you were there before he was there.
yes, and then you
You
double back and pick him up and
Then
go
you
out on the
double-
trip.
Okay,
right.
yeah, that's kind of what I
Right.
want to get clarified.
For instance, here in Dallas, the White House had an advanced man by the name of Jerry Bruno.
Okay.
And he, wasn't it, it was Jerry, wasn't it? Jerry Bruno was the advanced man here. But, you know, as to what the schedule was going to be,
Yeah.
all that has to be taken into consideration because you have your local press to consider, you have the needs of the local press, you have the needs of the, in other words, and you can't go pulling a motorcade into town, into New York City at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they'll all hate you and won't vote for you, especially if it's an election year.
Yeah.
If it's in an off year, you can forget it and hope they forget it. But yeah, you know, and so every place the president goes, he has to be advanced, not just by Secret Service, but also by his communicators, the White House Communications Agency, as it was known there, WACA. I forgot what it's referred to now because it's a combined command now of Navy and Army.
Was there anything particularly different in advance to the trip to Texas, and I guess maybe specifically when the subject of Dallas being on the itinerary?
No, we
came
were,
up?
of course, very aware of the fact that in his visit to Dallas in October, I believe it was, or maybe September, Adlai Stevenson had been belted with rotten eggs. Right?
Well, yeah, he got hit with a poster, a picket.
Yeah,
Had a poster that,
right. And then there was some
brought
rotten
down and
eggs
said,
thrown, because
yeah.
I remember a great Herb Block cartoon
Yeah.
showed the seal of Texas and two rotten eggs dripping from it.
Yeah.
That it was a, you know, that it was. And so, and we knew, at that point, we knew that the forces of Goldwater were starting to pick up in '63, preparatory to a run in '64 against Kennedy. But surprisingly enough, we saw in the day before, on November 21st, before we got here to Dallas, and in our other stops, we had seen very few Goldwater signs. Yes, we'd seen a few of them, and we'd seen a sign, you know, "Shame on you" for Cuba and all this business.
Yeah.
But not too many, not to reflect the feeling that sometimes today people are crediting with what the feeling was at that time. And I don't think that Dallas had any, I didn't sense anything in Dallas. I know there was a full-page advertising on
There's a copy of that in our exhibit.
Is it? Yeah, I remember seeing that morning, because we saw that over in, I was staying at the Texas Hotel the night before in Fort Worth. We saw that in the
You had
early
seen
in the
that
morning.
before you came to
Before we
Dallas,
even hit the
yeah.
ground, yeah, the paper had been
Yeah.
over there.
Well, I think there was some discussion, wasn't there, that morning about, say, whether to put the bubble on the limo or something?
There was,
Were you around? Did they
yeah,
have-
but the president always wasn't, unless there was a weather reason to leave the bubble off. And the bubble wasn't really that important, because
Yeah.
that bubble was not the bubble that exists
Not
today.
bulletproof or anything.
It was a piece of plastic is all it was.
Yeah.
I mean, it folded up in, what was it, Bill, 2 parts? And 2 parts that folded up and went into the trunk. And all it was to protect him from the weather.
From the
Now, I
weather.
don't say that the bullet would have gotten a good, as clean a shot through that bubble as it would without the bubble, but you still could have gotten at him with the bubble on top. But the president always felt that the people, if the people were good enough to come out and see him, he was good enough to sit there in the open car and let them see him, and so he could see them, because he enjoyed that. I mean, you take a look at the
Well-
pictures when John Kennedy arrived at Love Field.
Yes.
You know, the smile on his face, and there was nothing very comfortable about his doing that because of his back. He had an awful lot of
Yeah.
trouble with his back. But you go over a period of years in any of these books that you have here of pictures of Kennedy in a crowd. I've got some pictures. There's one picture I've got in Costa Rica, for instance, where there are thousands of people. I think it must have been the whole country. And in one little dot, you can see the president. He was mobbed in because they had set up quote, police lines. The only problem was that the police lines, the Costa Ricans didn't quite understand it, is what we meant by using barricades. They had school children who all carefully made little paper link chains, and they went out to, quote, hold the crowd back. And so you can imagine what happened. But I mean, you know, we never thought of that. But that, and you know, and I think, I look at that picture today, and I think, look at this. Here he was in Costa Rica, mobbed by thousands of people, Secret Service, completely out of control, totally out of control. God, he was safer there than he was on the streets of the United States. Not necessarily on the streets in Dallas, because I don't buy that Dallas is, you know, has any shame to live down. I don't think it does. Because after all, there have been, after all, McKinley was killed in Buffalo, and I've never heard that Buffalo goes around wearing a mourning band. I don't see any sense.
Well, kind of recall for us, if you can, say, arriving in Dallas, what your impressions were.
Well, of course, there was
along the way.
no arrival ceremony scheduled for
Yeah.
Love Field as such. It was announced what time he would arrive approximately and where he would arrive. And as the films will show, we had a pretty good crowd out there.
Yeah,
at
there were a
Love
lot of
Field.
people out there.
There were a
Yeah.
lot, but there was no speaker stand set up.
No.
There was no microphone set up, so that we had no arrival. Typically, you would have arrival remarks, but he didn't have any arrival remarks, and indeed didn't make any. He and Jackie, as we would call it, worked the crowd, worked the fence. And
And that was totally by design. I mean, he did not want to do anything at the airport. I mean, the big event, I guess,
that's right.
was a luncheon
At the,
the
trademark,
yeah.
right.
and the
that was
motorcade,
to,
of
and that
course.
was to be the big event. And of course, he was very, very mindful that he was walking into a political
Yeah.
bed of the forces loyal to Ralph Yarborough and those forces, those Democratic forces, loyal to John Connally, because he was very fond of Governor Connally, as everybody knows. And so therefore, you suddenly find, and Yarborough was riding in the car with Johnson, and he didn't really know why, and I don't think Johnson knew why either.
Well, they were
And-
well-known political enemies.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, here they were in various
Uh-huh.
places, sitting next to each other and riding in cars
Yeah.
together, and I never saw two unhappier fellows in
Neither
my
one was very
life.
happy
No.
about that,
They weren't very happy about that whole thing, but it was important, and Kennedy was thinking of the 1964 elections,
Yeah.
and he did consider this area particularly as being key to his own re-election bid in 1964, and to try to meld the forces
Yeah.
loyal to Connally and those loyal to Yarborough, and to come up with a unified Democratic Party. He considered that this trip was
Yeah.
necessary, to the extent that since 1960, when he was elected, Mrs. Kennedy had not gone on any political
I know
trips.
that.
I mean, she went to
get you to comment on
yeah,
that.
she went to Canada with him, and she accompanied him to Paris,
Yeah.
which he mentioned in his speech at Fort Worth that morning.
Yeah. Mhm.
And but aside from that, she did, and she really didn't like political trips. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's the truth, and everybody knows it. No sense in edging on the issue, but that's how important this trip
This was.
was to him. And I think she was rather enjoying it, if you want to know the truth.
You think so? Yeah, I was wondering
Yeah.
about what impressions you would gain, not necessarily in Dallas, but say, along the way.
Yeah, no, she seemed to
how
be
she was
enjoying
feeling
it.
it,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think
Well,
that,
being the subject of a great deal of adulation and so forth.
yeah, and well, really, and I think, and he also knew something, and being as shrewd a politician as he was, and he said this, that as many people would come out to see her as would come out to see him. You know, at that point, you take any vote.
Yeah. Well, you talked about a sort of sparsity, perhaps, of, say, Goldwater. Did that hold true along the Dallas route? You came in from the
Yeah.
airport?
Yeah, you can see it in the films. You'll see
Well,
a few.
that's the impression I had, too.
Yeah.
That people had said there really was very few.
There were some
negative-
anti-Cuba signs,
Yeah.
but that was understandable, and we knew that because of your free Cuba movement that was active.
Well, we must inevitably get to
Yeah, right.
the point of getting down to the street in front that runs in front of this
Right. Well,
building where we are right
we
now.
took this.
And so if you can kind of walk us through that,
Well, I was riding in the press car,
which was in relationship to the
The
president's
three
memo.
afterwards.
3 after, okay.
and that was in any presidential motorcade in those days, you had a pool car, which was made up of 4 reporters,
Yes.
and usually in the press secretary.
Mhm.
And then behind that, you'd have a pool of cameramen in one car, still cameramen, and in another car, motion picture cameramen for the television cameras. Because in those days, they were shooting 16mm film.
Yeah.
So you had the 3 pool cars, and in the pool car I was riding in, press secretary's car, and the reason I was on that trip as acting press secretary for the trip is that Pierre Salinger, President Kennedy's press secretary, was on his way to Japan.
Yeah, that's right. He was
With Doug Dillon and
Mhm.
Dean Rusk
Mhm.
for an economic conference, and he had decided he'd go along on that
Mhm.
as a White House representative.
Mhm.
That's enough said about that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that was the reason I was on the trip rather
Yeah.
than Salinger. I would have been on the trip and been in the motorcade somewhere, but certainly
Yeah.
not up there had this
Yes, in
not.
that
And
spot.
the 4 pool reporters were Bob Clark of ABC, Bob Baskin of the Dallas Morning News, excuse me, Jack Bell of Associated Press,
Yeah.
and of course Merriman Smith of
Yes,
United
yeah.
Press. And of course the driver was an employee of of the Bell system, who was, and we had the one phone in the car. So as we came we turned right here
Right
at
out.
that window,
Mhm.
and
This is off of Houston onto Elm Street and going down towards what's called the Triple Underpass.
triple
here.
underpass. Right as we passed there, I heard this first noise, and Merriman Smith said, "What the hell was that?" And I said, "Well, it sounded to me like a firecracker." And I remember having the thought process, well, it's a week before Thanksgiving, and they sell fireworks here. I mean, that much I can remember. And then the second shot, by that time I noticed that Clint Hill, who was a Secret Service agent assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, had jumped off the Secret Service follow-up car and was running towards the president's car. But then I looked up from where the second shot came from, and I was looking, of course, at the sixth, looking up at this building.
Yes.
Now, I cannot say that I was looking at the exact location it was coming from,
yeah,
but I knew
the
it
sound
was
came
coming
from that
from
direction.
above and over my right shoulder. It was not
Yeah.
coming from the grassy knoll over there
Yeah.
at all. It was coming from above me and from my rear. And I
Yeah.
looked back there, and I could not, very honestly, I could not see anything. And
Yeah.
of course, now that I've seen it, I can
That's just
understand
after
why.
2 shots had
That's
been
right.
fired.
That's
Okay.
right. And then there was a longer space between the first and second than there was between the second and the third shots. And then I noticed that the Secret Service car and the president's car had started to speed up.
Yes.
So we sped up in the pool car. But that still didn't surprise me,
Yeah.
because after all, it was obvious that something untoward had happened, and that this would be a normal operating procedure to get the hell out of there
Yeah.
in a big hurry.
Yeah.
And it never, and of course Merriman Smith grabbed the phone in the pool car to say that shots had been fired at the presidential motorcade. At that time, and not until we got to Parkland Hospital, did any of us know to what extent. And I remember thinking that, gee, I wonder if they shot Connolly. Mrs. Kennedy? You know, it never even occurred to me that the president had been shot.
What,
I mean, I've
why
heard
do you,
people
why do you
say-
think why do you think you thought? it
Because
might
I
have been
think that it
Connolly
is, you know,
first?
this is America. It's inconceivable.
Okay.
The inconceivable nature of it all. Just block that thought from. That's the last thing you know. This is America. We don't. We're not like a banana republic where we're going shooting off our leaders right and left. Of course, the fact remains is we've killed 6, or shot at 6, and if you take. You know, Roosevelt with Mayor Cermak of Chicago was killed. You take Harry Truman, and you take McKinley, Lincoln, Garfield. I forgot who else there was. Who else?
Reagan.
Well, that was before Reagan.
Oh,
yeah,
before Reagan.
Before
I mean,
Reagan.
yeah, you're talking before.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Yeah, that's right. Excuse me.
But I mean, you know, we're not the freest nation in the world of having taken our leaders out the hard way. But nevertheless, I guess because when you're that close, the last thing you think of course, and I didn't have the view of the president and some of the people on the grassy knoll did, that who responded to newsmen saying he I saw him clutch his throat.
Yeah.
Which of course we saw that in the Zabruta
In
film.
the films later.
Yeah. And even as we pulled, and of course as we drove out, I didn't know the area that well,
Yeah.
so therefore I didn't know where the Trade Mart was, where we were headed
Yeah.
for lunch or anything else. And then we pulled into Parkland Hospital, and I ran around, as some of those film clips yours will show. I ran out of the car and went over, and there was the president, you know, slumped over in Mrs. Kennedy's lap. And of course they couldn't remove him from the back of the car until they removed Connolly and Nellie, because they were sitting on the jump seats in front of the president and Mrs. Kennedy. So they got Connolly out of there, and Mrs. Connolly, and then they removed the president. And that's when we went into the emergency entrance there at the back of Parkland.
Who was the security that was kind of managing this? Was this the Secret Service, the
Yes.
Dallas Police, both?
No,
I mean,
Secret Service, it was Roy Kellerman stayed with the president
They
the whole
knew
time.
you went in with them.
That's right, and I also had police
You also
identification.
had
We,
ID.
we always wore buttons of different
Okay.
shades and colors. Bill here can tell you, same thing. We'd go on different trips, and we'd have a trip button. It might just be a blue porcelain button with a white dot in it, and other times it'd be green with a orange dot in it, and all the police would have a card that would show what the authorized buttons were.
Yeah.
Some of them were circles, they were staff. Some of them
I
would be
see.
triangles, they were security. Some of them would be squares, they'd be a signal corps, something like that.
Yeah.
And
Well, I
they-
know that they shut it down, or I understand they shut it down right away as letting anybody get into the hospital back there. say, a guy in a business suit if you didn't have your other
Yeah, they
identity? You
did,
would've
and,
got-
but the Secret Service even got to the point where they didn't even allow the Dallas police in,
Yeah, well, I'd heard
which
that.
got a little testy there.
Yeah.
But Kellerman shut it down just completely. And after we got there, and when we got to the hospital, it still didn't occur to me that the president was dead.
You did not say visually, say looking at him in the car.
He was a mess.
But
But
you didn't.
I guess I had a mental
At
block.
that point, he's dead.
No,
you know.
I did not. And I went in, and I remember my thinking and recalling back when Eisenhower had a heart attack back in Denver one time.
Uh-huh.
That Jim Haggerty had set up a press room, and they had a press thing. I don't know why I thought of those things. I just did. So I told a fellow who was traveling with us by the name of Wayne Hawks, who was on the staff, to go find something we could use as a press room. He came up with a nurse's instruction room out there at Parkland. And get a hold of the telephone company to start getting some press phones in, because you know, you couldn't get apparently, from what I've heard, you couldn't even get the phones lines were just jammed here in Dallas.
No, well, yeah, they were. I know some of the reports.
But I
said
do
they
know
couldn't
some of the
get out.
people. I know Merriman Smith got a hold of a coin telephone right there outside the emergency entrance, and he got an open line right away and opened to Washington, and it stayed open. So there was no problem there. Jack Bell again was not very. He just lucked out all the way. I mean, had no luck at all. Smith had all the luck in finding the phones and everything else. By the way, he got Smith eventually got the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of that.
Yeah, yeah.
And ended up blowing his head off, but
Luck-
committing suicide.
Luck sometimes does play a role in these things.
Yeah.
Who were you working with, say, at the hospital in terms of getting information about the
Dr.
president?
Perry.
Dr. Perry.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was Malcolm
Malcolm
Perry.
Perry, yeah.
Yeah, same name as mine.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he's the one who told me.
Okay, so.
And I don't know who Bill Stinson was working with.
Yeah.
Who was, of course, he was working on the Conley side of it too, and we were equally concerned about getting information out on both of them.
Who, besides yourself, was, say, involved in the process of deciding when we're going to announce, what we're going to announce? What we're
Okay,
gonna, sort of,
when it became apparent to me that the president was dead, and that was within a very few minutes after we got there, before 1 o'clock, I went to Kenneth O'Donnell and I said, Kenny, I said, we're going to have to announce the president's death. Kenny was chief of staff to Kennedy.
yeah.
And Kenny said to me, and Kenny, of course, had been
He'd been close with.
Kennedy's and
yeah.
a roommate of Bobby's at school. And, you know, this was his life. His life had just been shot away. Kenny's now dead. And he said, hell, he said, don't ask me. Go ask Johnson. So I went across the hall into a trauma room where Rufus Youngblood, his Johnson's Secret Service agent, was. And I walked in, and I didn't know what to call him. And I didn't know Lyndon Johnson that well.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd seen him around the White House. He knew me by name, and I, naturally, you know. But I walked up to him, and I suddenly realized I didn't know what to call him. The situation, de facto, he was the president. I said, Mr. President. And Lady Bird just kind of screamed.
Yeah.
Kind of let out a audible. And apparently, and according to him, and according to some writings of his, when I said that to him was the first solid information that he had that he was the de facto president. I said, I'm going to have to announce President Kennedy's death. And he said, well, and it's very interesting. And, you know, the man was a great historian. He had a great mind for history, Lyndon Johnson did. We don't know what kind of a conspiracy this might be. And later, and you could see it going through his mind of Booth, you know, with Lincoln and all this Mary Surratt conspiracy and all this business going through his head. He said, but I think Byrd and I ought to get out of here and back to Air Force One before you make the announcement. And I said, all right. So he said, come on, he said to Rufus, he said, let's go on back to the plane. And by that time, we knew that the president would be transported. The body would go back on Air Force One.
Yeah.
Now, the Secret Service made the determination that Lyndon Johnson would go back on Air Force One. A lot of people have been critical of Johnson, saying that he seized power at an opportune moment. It was not. It was on the advice of the Secret Service on going back to Air Force One. And number two, it was on the advice of Secret Service to use Air Force One rather than the backup plane, which was the second plane, Air Force Two, if you will. When we got him out of the emergency entrance, I walked out with him. Bob Pierpoint, I remember, of CBS, said he remembers seeing me come out, but doesn't remember seeing Johnson. Well, I don't know how he could ever miss Lyndon Johnson. I mean, we put him in the car, and we got back, and as soon as we got the word, and in those days the code was I always tickled me, his code name was Volunteer. And it always tickled me because Lyndon Johnson was about as much of a volunteer to being in the White House as nothing, but it was kind of amusing. And it said that Volunteer had returned to Angel. And as soon as I got that, Angel was the code name for Air Force One.
Were there other reactions? I mean, do you think Johnson's reaction to fearing that there was a conspiracy, was that sort of the common reaction among the people within that
It wasn't
group,
in mine, and it wasn't in Kenny O'Donnell's. A lot of people have had second thoughts about it and have will say today, oh, I thought right away it was a conspiracy. Well, if they did, they sure as hell kept their mouth shut about it at the time. I think that, hindsight is always 20/20.
Yeah.
But I sure didn't hear about it, no. And they did not talk about it even there at the hospital or even coming back on Air Force One.
Yeah.
But Johnson, you could see it. He was forever the historian.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by that time, of course, and then after he'd cleared and after I'd received word that he was back, and at approximately 1:31, I went ahead and made the announcement that you have here. At least I think you have it.
Yes, we do have it.
And made the announcement. And then when the body was returned to, they wanted to keep the body here for an autopsy.
Yes.
And that's when Roy Kellerman and some other agents and myself formed sort of a flying wedge. And the Dallas police were told to keep the body here. And Roy Kellerman had received word from headquarters to bring it back to Washington for an autopsy at Walter Reed.
Yeah.
Or at Bethesda Naval, whichever was to be used. And we flew out that door and put the casket in the an ambulance, and we took off, and I went to Love Field.
How spirited was the effort to keep you from doing that?
There were a couple of detectives who were quite spirited upon them. I remember looking down on them on the floor as I passed them. One of them took a rather nasty hit, I don't know by whom, but one of them went down.
Well, there was a law or an ordinance or whatever that the body couldn't be removed, but we did an oral history with Henry Wade, who was the district attorney at the time, and he rather wryly observed that, well, it was breaking a law, but the only penalty for that law was a $100 fine.
Oh, really?
Was anybody aware of that?
No.
It wasn't that big a deal.
No, and then we went back to Air Force One, and by that time, Lyndon Johnson had contacted the Attorney General, of course, President's brother.
Yes.
You know, and calling a spade, and you got to do it. There was no love lost between Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy. Even though he stayed on as Attorney General, they were not exactly enamored of each other. But Bobby advised him that in case any presidential decisions, not knowing what was going on, that it would be best if he was sworn in here.
Okay, so that came from Bobby Kennedy.
That came from Bobby Kennedy. Now here again, history loves to rewrite itself, because you'll find among some of the Kennedy people here again that Johnson had seized the power as quickly as he could. He did not. do that at all. He did this on the advice of the Kennedys. If you accept Bobby as the Kennedys,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
I think you have to.
Yeah.
So that was a decision made by the Attorney General that he should be sworn in. And of course, he was sworn in, as we have photographic knowledge on Air Force One, and sworn in by Judge Sarah Hughes, which of course was another slight irony, as you probably know. Since,
Well, and you want to explain that for us? Or?
well, he, as you know, Lyndon Johnson had opposed her appointment to the federal bench, as a federal district court judge, and it's every time I see that picture of the swearing in with President Lyndon Johnson looking down at Judge Sarah Hughes, wondering to myself, now what in the world was he really thinking of all the judges in this world? They had to find this one.
Well, she was sort of a leading jurist in the city, and at least in terms of a public profile. I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not. But
no, it's just, I think they got a hold of the first federal
yeah.
court judge that they could.
that was her.
Just happened to be her, and I know that it was reported back to me that he had opposed her appointment to the federal bench.
Now, did you go from the hospital with the casket, or
You mean
back to the Air Force One at Love Field? I mean,
Yes.
in Dallas. Get
Yes.
back. Okay. Now, as you pointed out, we looked at the photograph. You were recording the swearing in. That's the only
That's correct. On Air Force
audio
One, in the
record
president's
of that.
cabin.
You
That's
had
right.
the foresight to do that. And
Yeah.
You want to tell us about that? I mean,
No, well, as we got on Air Force One, and all the Kennedy people were in the far aft section of the plane around the casket. They had removed 4 seats from the back section. That back section of Air Force One at that time contained a conference room and a bedroom, and then behind that 4 more seats and an aft galley. They had removed the seats from the 4 seats to make room for the casket. The Kennedy, some of the Kennedy people, Pamela Tourneur, Mrs. Kennedy's press secretary, Mrs. Gallagher, Mrs. Kennedy's secretary, was back there with her. Ken O'Donnell and Dave Powers stayed in the aft section of that plane. Then when Judge Hughes came aboard, the president asked that Mrs. Kennedy be invited to come up during his swearing in. I suppose that was a no-win situation.
Yeah.
That some of the people would be critical that he wanted her by his side, whether despite any ill feelings that there might have been. But she did come forward. She was only too gracious about coming forward. She never blinked an eye, twitched a muscle. And on some of those pictures, again, you can see the blood on that red suit of hers. And she stood right next to him as he was sworn in as our president. And then within very few moments, of course, after Judge Hughes left the aircraft, we were airborne and back to Washington.
Nothing on that flight. Whether you want to.
Yeah, everybody. We all drank about as much as human beings could possibly consume, but nobody got drunk.
Yeah.
It was absolutely amazing. I don't know how much we had to drink or how many of us did drink, but I know I had plenty, and yet that was on a Friday, and I did not end up going to bed for a full night's sleep until the following Wednesday.
Well, you sure had a kind of awesome responsibility on your shoulders at that time. Were you thinking about that when all this was happening?
No. I think it's one of those things that happens to you, and when it's all over. You ever been in a close call in an automobile accident, and you think everything's fine, and then an hour later you suddenly look at your hands and they're all filled with sweat?
Yeah.
It's but you're aware of the fact that here is history being made. You don't think of yourself in relationship to that history. In other words, you don't think of yourself, well, what part am I playing in history? That certainly I never didn't even think about. But suddenly, and you stop and you think, oh my God, what look what's happened. And and it was certainly far more traumatic than other things that I had witnessed. Such as the attempted assassination of Harry Truman, and of course the Sunday that my mother and father and I went to Lakehurst, New Jersey, to watch the Hindenburg come in.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that fellow that Al Capp used to draw, Joe Blitzfitz with a little black cloud over him. But no, you don't think about that at the time. You don't think about
What was maybe kind of the most difficult thing in that time period was just trying to...
The most difficult thing was to say that John Kennedy was dead. The film will show that. I stutter on that.
Yeah.
And I didn't get into it clean. Because I guess it's sort of like telling somebody that a close friend has died. It's hard to come out. It's hard. You don't want to say it because once you've said it, it makes it so. And in reflection, I think that's how I felt. I know that's how I felt. That by saying it, it's so. And if I don't say it, it won't be so.
What do you remember about, say, the press that you were making this announcement to?
I have no recollection of the press in front of me.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
I just, to me, it was a sea of faces. I remember off to one side, there was a great fellow from the Washington Post, old fellow. He's dead now. Can't remember, but I remember him. He was a marvelous, good old what's his name, but I mean, it was he was just, Eddie Folliard had been with the Washington Post for a year. I remember seeing him over there. And I remember Merriman Smith right in front of me, of course. And I remember a fellow by the name of Chuck Reynolds, who was a guy with the Alderson Reporting Company. He did the stenotyping. He was sitting right in front of me. One of your photos, I think, around here shows that. Or maybe it's just in my book.
What about when you got back to Washington? Of course, this was a different group, press.
Well, a whole lot of people had been brought in. I don't know by whom or for what purpose into the White House. By the time we got back, somebody was working at my desk and somebody was working at Salinger's desk, and there was a fellow by the name of Paul Southwick, who was a very good friend of mine. He kind of taken over my desk, and I had to kind of reclaim it and tell him to get out. And he said, well, I've been asked to come in to help out. I said, help out what? I said, you don't have anything to help out. Well, they're making the funeral arrangements. I said, well, I'm not going to make the funeral arrangements. I said, neither are you. I said, the Kennedy family's going to be making the funeral arrangements with the assistance of the military district of Washington. Now get out of my desk. But there was a little bit, I guess really what it was is nobody knew what to do. So therefore everybody was doing what they thought somebody would want. And it was confusion, let's face it. It had to be confusion.
Did procedures or anything much change, say, within your office, say, after the assassination took place?
No, not in the press office. If local organizations wanted to cover the arrival of the president, they'd have to let the local politicians or who was ever running the show know in advance enough in advance who they were going to assign, what their social security number was, so they could throw it through a computer. But if a president is going to Keokuk and he's going to address 10,000 people, why worry about 3 reporters from the Keokuk Times and do a whole check on them, because you're not going to be able to do a check on the 10,000 that are going to get probably tickets from every ward healer and either that or grocery store clerk in Keokuk.
Was kind of the inner circle at the White House kind of quickly make a transition over to we have to continue business as usual?
I think most of us did. There were some of them who spent an awful lot of time kind of mourning the president's passing. And it's too bad, because some of them were very talented people who just more or less kind of made a career out of being Kennedy mourners. But to me, it was kind of, the torch has passed, as they'd said, and the king is dead, long live the king. We're a country whose laws provide for such things. You have to go on. The government goes on. The government doesn't stop.
Were you, say, in your office Saturday as opposed to, and then Sunday when during the funeral proceedings, and then
I was on my way up to there were services up at the rotunda of the Capitol that day, and I was going up on my way up to, and we had to share our cars. We had a garage then that had a few more cars than Mr. Clinton is allowing. He apparently has cut down on the number of cars, which won't last, but he wants to think it does.
Make the gesture.
Yeah, make the big gesture. And I know I shared my car with Billy Graham. As a matter of fact, we were in the car.
Right.
I was in the car when a message came over that Oswald had been shot by Ruby.
That's where
And
you
the only
were.
problem was, they got the message garbled. They immediately knew who had shot Oswald. They got the name slightly wrong. They said it had been shot by Jack Rubley.
Rubley?
You remember the L in there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Signal Corps officer who we left here to cover was a Major Jack Rubley,
Oh, my God.
which was funny. You remember him,
I
Bill?
guess so. And you were with Billy Graham at that
I was with
time?
Billy Graham, was in my car.
You recall his reaction or anything
Oh, he said,
had
well,
to
just
say?
how, he said, isn't that terrible? When will this all end? Sort of
Yeah.
attitude.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Well, go ahead.
you can't do that chest thumping too much because, things are going to
Mhm.
happen. It's just,
Well, I guess, the Ruby thing was one of the major contributions to all the
conspiracy. Oh,
theories
sure.
that set off later.
Right, exactly.
And,
But I just, I've never seen, of all these books that you have here, of all these great, post-mortems and the Oswald affair and all this, you mean to tell me they couldn't pin it down if it was actually a conspiracy?
Yeah,
I can't buy that.
Who had to deal with all the talk, speaking of sort of the problems of dealing with the press office, dealing with all the dignitaries that came in for the funeral? all
No,
that kind
the
of stuff?
State
Was it
Department, no,
State
most of
Department
the
did that?
State Department Office of Protocol
Yeah,
did that, yeah.
yeah.
We had many people coming in from overseas. Of course, in June of '63, President Kennedy had been to Ireland, and a big group had come over from Ireland, including one of the fellows he was the chairman of the New Ross County Council. And I had done, he was one of the favorites of Kennedy's that Kennedy met on the trip over there. I did the advance work. And his name was Andrew Minahan. And he had a big red beard, and he was a great-looking man. And the map of Ireland, he made Barry Fitzgerald look like an Arab. I mean, it was just marvelous. And he came over, and he was just, they just loved him in Ireland.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, I never saw a crowd. I think the whole nation was at every one of our stops in Ireland. I never saw such crowds in my life.
Well, one of the people from Dallas, one of the community leaders, who later became Mayor Eric Johnson, was one of the representatives from Dallas who went to Washington, felt they should have some
Sure.
presence there, and said that they were standing on a hotel room balcony looking out, and with the gall, and said, the thought occurred to them, if we had a rifle here, we could have taken out.
Oh, you mean on the parade up to
Yeah,
the... Well,
parade
he
up.
must have been staying at the Mayflower Hotel.
Yeah, I think that's where he was.
Yeah, because that's where we went. That's where that parade. I've seen every time I see that, de Gaulle marched right at the head of that
Yeah.
foreign, and he was a pot shot for anybody. And remember, he
Yeah,
was having
right.
trouble in Algeria at the
Yeah.
time. And you go to Paris 3 or 4 times a night, you'd hear that or
Yeah.
somebody racing because they'd set another bomb off.
Yeah.
And he refused Secret Service protection. He absolutely would have no bodyguards around him for that walk from the White House
Yeah.
all the way, and he's almost blind as a bat.
Well,
He
he's in one of the films in the exhibit, there's a clip of that.
Yeah,
he-
just
he really-
blind as a bat. And here he walked just as stiff as he could right up Connecticut Avenue to St. Matthews, and I'll tell you, that was one impressive sight. The only other impressive sight that impressed me more was at the graveside.
Describe that for us.
Well, after the services at St. Matthews, the motorcade went its way out to Constitution Avenue, across Memorial Bridge, up to Arlington Cemetery. Going to Arlington Cemetery for me was kind of like old home weekend. Most of my family members are buried there. And as the services were going off on that knoll just beneath the Lee House, the Robert E. Lee mansion. Air Force One, and it's on a hill, and we're looking up at the mansion, and the grave is down here. Suddenly Air Force One comes across. They'd had the fighter planes coming with a missing man formation. Then Air Force One came in at about 500 feet. And 26000 and dipped its wings. And I tell you, that sent a chill right up my spine. And I was doing great until that, and I kind of broke down a little bit.
Well, that was
Jim
when,
Swindell did a real dip. I mean, he dipped that baby. You know, why you start dipping a 707? You're dipping a hunk of machinery, I'll tell you. That was a very, very
well, it's a very
poignant moment.
Poignant also moment with Walter Cronkite in some of the videos we have where he passed along. I think you saw that little part of that where he had to pass along the announcement where he obviously was choking and holding back. That, maybe that's when that kind of hit him too, I think.
Yeah, he went through the same thing when Bobby was killed. I spotted for Cronkite. Don Hewitt, who's an executive producer for 60 Minutes, called me the night Bobby was killed and asked me to get to New York right away, and could I do it? And I said yes. In '68, and I went up there and I did what someone is spotting, and I stayed in the control room and spotted, and I was feeding Cronkite all who these various people were who were on the train, and as the train came to Washington and all that. But he's a very emotional guy, Cronkite.
Well, I guess all of us who are old enough to recall it, at some point there, it really hit us too. Right. It really hit you that way. Well, just to kind of clarify one little other thing about talking about the 3 shots, you were satisfied they all came from the same direction.
There's never been any...
Same sound, same...
Never any question in my mind from that day to this as from where the shots originated, the sound of them, and where they... No, absolutely not. I was never...
Did you compare notes with any of the other people, say, in the motorcade about that or anything like that?
No, because the others in the motorcade, the others in the newsmen were in my car. They were not even in as good a position as I was to hear it because I had the open window. Merriman Smith was sitting in the middle. I've talked to Secret Service men like Roy Kellerman, who was riding a shotgun in the front seat. Talked to Clint Hill, and Clint, Roy's dead now, which I didn't even know until a couple months ago. But there was never any question in their mind.
Seems to be the general... feeling.
No, but I mean, for somebody like Mark Lane, it makes for great copy when you want to write another book and make another couple of $1,000s on a lecture tour around the country when you weren't even there.
Before we end these interviews, I always ask the subject if there's anything that we have not discussed.
No, not really. I just, the only thing that I would say, and the one thing that I think most Americans are not appreciative of, and I'm not saying that just because I'm taping in Texas. I've said it for 30 years that I don't think I don't think that we could have been in better shape than having the government turned over to Lyndon Johnson. That he was the master of it from the first moment. That he had he was the calmest and coolest of us all. Seemed to know exactly what should be done, and I think that he proved that it was he was a credit to the American political system as to how as they would say, how the torch was passed.
We'll wrap up American Perspectives tonight with an oral history from Don Hewitt. He's better known today as the creator of 60 Minutes. But in November 1963, he was the executive producer of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. In this interview, Mr. Hewitt recounts the JFK assassination from a journalist perspective. It was part of an oral history project conducted by the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza.
The interview we are doing today is part of the oral history collection for the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, and today we are joined by Mr. Don Hewitt. Thank you very much, Mr. Hewitt, for taking the time to come to the museum and record this interview while you're visiting Dallas. And from this point on, we'll go on a first-name basis, Don and Stephen, for the remainder of the interview.
I like that.
All right. As we do with all of our oral histories, for the record, could you please give us your full name, date and place of birth, and a brief summary of your whole life and career?
Okay. My name is Don Hewitt. I was born December 14th, 1922 in New York City. I've worked for CBS News for the last 55 years. First as the producer of the CBS Evening News with first a man named Douglas Edwards and then with Walter Cronkite. I started a broadcast called 60 Minutes in 1968, which is still going strong. And that was what brought me down here to Dallas to accept the Alger Meadows Award, which is very big in Texas, and I'm afraid nobody outside of Dallas knows what it is. But here I am, and Jack Kennedy happened to be, I can't say he was a close friend, but he was somebody I'd worked with, worked around, knew quite a bit about, was part of my early years, and was probably as devastated as anybody in the country by the assassination. And fire away, Stephen.
Could you maybe talk about your perceptions of Dallas, Texas prior to November '63? I mean, what, you know, when you thought of Dallas, what did that even
Cowboys. You know, I think the whole world. Listen, let me tell you a great Dallas Cowboy story, and then I'll get on.
No.
My friend David Frost, Sir David Frost, came to Dallas a couple of years ago to speak at SMU. And he brought his secretary, his English secretary with him, who'd never been in the States before, let alone in Texas. And they went out to dinner. And she excused herself from the table to go to the ladies' room. And she came back 30 seconds later and she said, "David, am I a steer or a heifer?" Now, it kind of tells me on. You want to talk about the,
Sure.
Okay. I've got it in my book, if you let me read.
Sure.
Okay, is that all right?
That's absolutely.
Okay. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, I was preparing to go out to lunch when the chatter of the AP teletype was interrupted by alarm bells. That meant that something had happened somewhere in the world that editors should immediately take note of. The alarm bells that went off that afternoon signaled the biggest story I ever remember having a hand in, and that includes the D-Day landings. I was at Omaha Beach in Normandy. Were we under attack? Had an enemy decided the best way to go to war with us was to knock out not a naval base as the Japanese had in 1941, but the President of the United States? Until Lyndon Johnson raised his hand on Air Force One and took the oath of office, no one was sure that government as we knew it was still intact. We went into our fire alarm mode and crashed our way onto the air with a bullet. However, Tig Mickelson, the vice president who ran CBS News, was already on his way to lunch, and I needed some guidance on how long to let Cronkite stay on the air. So I picked up the phone and I called the president of CBS, Frank Stanton, who at the moment was in a meeting so important, he told his secretary he was not to be interrupted. "Sorry, Mr. Hewitt," she said, "I have instructions not to interrupt him. He'll have to call you back." "Tell him the president's been shot," I said, "and he might be dead before he can call me back." "Hold on," she said. A second or so later, Stanton was on the line. "Keep Walter on the air," he said, "until you know whether the president's dead or alive." A few seconds later, he called back and said, "Forget what I just said. Even if the president survives, don't go back on the air." "I'm on my way to your office," he said, "and we'll run the network from there," which we did. Television in America, across America, went on as one people everywhere looking for someone to tell them that we were going to be all right and that our nation would survive. And that job fell to Walter Cronkite. That day, that weekend, Cronkite, who already was everybody's uncle, became everybody's priest, everybody's minister, and everybody's rabbi. He was the glue that held America together. Dan Rather, new to CBS and our correspondent on the scene, phoned me from Dallas and told me that a guy named Zapruder was supposed to have film of the assassination and was going to put it up for sale. In fact, he eventually did. You sold it to Life magazine for reported $600,000. In my desire to get a hold of what was probably the most dramatic piece of news footage ever shot, I told Rather, go to Zapruder's house, sock him in the jaw, take his film to our affiliate in Dallas, copy it onto videotape, and let the CBS lawyers decide whether it could be sold or whether it was in the public domain. Then take the film back to Zapruder's house, give it back to him. That way, the only thing that they could get him for was assault, because he would have returned Zapruder's property. Rather said, great idea, I'll do it. I hadn't hung up the phone maybe 10 seconds when it hit me. What in the hell did you just do? I called Rather back. Luckily, he was still there, and I said to him, for Christ's sake, don't do what I just told you to. I think this day has gotten to me, and thank God I caught you before you left. Knowing Dan to be as competitive as I am, I had the feeling that he'd wish he'd left before the second phone call. The things you do in the heat of battle. Because I had a hand in the so-called debate that helped catapult Jack Kennedy into the White House, I felt in a strange way bonded to him as I'd never felt to another president. And when an assassin's bullet ended his life, I mourned his loss about as keenly as I remember mourning the loss of Franklin Roosevelt. The plain, honest-to-God truth about JFK was that despite his potential for greatness, he realized very little of it between the time of his "Ask not what your country can do for you" inaugural speech and the motorcade that took him through Dallas's Dealey Plaza and to the emergency room at Parkland Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Assassinating John F. Kennedy made even less sense, I thought, than the Warren Commission report about who did it and why. I always believed that the commission held something back and that there was a lot more to the story than we were allowed to be privy to. That's why one morning, sitting with Bobby Kennedy in the backyard of his house at Hickory Hill, just the two of us, drinking iced tea and talking about a broadcast I wanted to be a part of, I decided, with more guts than brains, to ask him the big one, the million-dollar question. Bobby, do you really believe Lee Harvey Oswald, all by himself, killed your brother? He dismissed the question almost with a studied indifference. What difference does it make, he said. It won't bring him back. I never believed that Bobby believed, what difference does it make? And I've always believed that he knew something he didn't want to share with me or anyone else, and that whatever was still being kept in the dark about that fateful day, he preferred it stay in the dark. In the fall of 2002, I had occasion to be in Chicago with Ted Sorensen, who had been President Kennedy's counsel, and I told him about my conversation over 30 years ago with Bobby. Ted responded, it wasn't just Bobby, but all of those who were close to JFK felt more or less the same. What difference does it make? It won't bring him back. However, he did express the opinion, and I've gotten his permission to paraphrase it. I read this to Ted to make sure it was okay. That while it would surprise him to learn that Oswald had had accomplices, it would not dismay him. Should it someday surface that he had, because to learn that Oswald had accomplices, it would not dismay him that should someday surface that Oswald had accomplices, because it would lend some badly needed rhyme and reason to an act of insanity that up to now had neither. Be that as it may, I am still not satisfied that there isn't a lot more to the Lee Harvey Oswald story, especially, now this will stun you, since one of the respected Republicans who ever held office, Republicans, really solid guy, said to me in front of witnesses that he once asked Richard Nixon, what do you know about the Kennedy assassination? And Nixon said, you don't want to know. I tell you, I got cold chills that morning. But one of the things that sticks with me most about that November America, well, I'm not going to go any further. That, I will not tell you who, because he's still alive, and I'm not sure it was at a privileged breakfast. But when he said, I asked Nixon, and Nixon said, you don't want to know, it reinforced what I've always believed. I've always believed that Lyndon Johnson knew a lot more, that Allen Dulles knew a lot more, and that Richard Nixon knew a lot more. And they thought that, now you've heard all the theories. We had, 60 Minutes had in New York with us, a woman who claimed to have been Lee Harvey Oswald's mistress. Whether she was or she wasn't, but she knew an awful lot about him. And she had pictures of herself lots of years ago. She was a dead ringer, Marina Oswald. She looked like her twin sister. Of all the things she told us about Oswald, the one thing that sticks in my mind, Jack Ruby was not a stranger to Lee Harvey Oswald. Jack Ruby was not a guy who went crazy when he found out his president had been killed and walked into the police station here and decided to kill him. Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle was an associate of Jack Ruby's in some shady business somewhere. They were both gangsters. And according to her, what she said she learned from Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle asked Jack Ruby, be sure and take care of my nephew, Lee, in case anything ever happens to me. I believe that Jack Ruby was hired to go there to make sure that Oswald never talked. She also, this was that part of the story I have no doubt about. She also told us an awful lot about Oswald and a CIA group in the Everglades of renegades. This part I've heard from Howard Hunt, who was part of the Watergate crowd. And I heard Howard Hunt on this subject. They hated the Kennedys because Eisenhower had promised air cover for the Bay of Pigs invasion, and Kennedy, I think it was Bobby who convinced Jack not to do it, denied them air cover for that invasion. And they claim that their comrades who died on the beaches during the Bay of Pigs invasion were left to die because of the Kennedys and vowed to get even. I don't know what the connections were, whether the connection was from a CIA group of renegades through the mafia to Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle, to Jack Ruby, to somebody here. But I believe if Oswald did it out of a window in this building, that kid was not smart enough to have figured all this out all by himself. Whether there were shots fired from the grassy knoll, we're never going to know that. Maybe someday we will. Somebody told me just this morning that Jackie's papers have some revelations about the assassination. I don't know whether that's true or not. But I am so convinced that one guy did not plan, and that the theories that a Richard Nixon you don't want to know, the rest of what the fact that I have tried to talk to Pierre Salinger, Dave Powers, Kenny O'Donnell, Steve Smith, Bobby. I did talk to Bobby and got Ted Sorensen. There is a veil of silence. among anybody in the Kennedy clan. And knowing Bobby Kennedy's temperament as an attorney general, Bobby Kennedy would have turned the world upside down if somebody had killed one of his kids, if somebody had killed Ethel. I mean, that was his nature. He would have never rested till he found the guy. The fact that he said, what difference does it make? It's not going to bring him back. I never believed that Teddy believed that.
Why do you think, I mean, it's our perception, or my perception, I should say, that the media has kind of historically, for the 40 intervening years, just kind of nursed along the Warren Commission. There's been the occasional kind of front line or these kind of, why has the media not gone after this story any more than they have? Or maybe that's
because I did. I brought that woman to New York. We had Gloria Borgia of no, she also works for U.S. News. Gloria and I were convinced that we were about to break the biggest story of our times, and yet a guy who's a lawyer for that senator I quoted, who was a member of the Warren Report, was a counsel at the Warren Report, was all for us. He kept saying, "You're on to something. Let's go ahead. Let's do this." The door was slammed in our face. All of a sudden, we came to the conclusion. Actually, Brian Duffy was the Washington bureau chief of U.S. News, who was doing it with us. And Brian called one day and said, "We don't have. We only have her story." Why have they all let it go? I would think there isn't a news guy in the world who wouldn't like to break that story. And somehow, how that story is unbreakable is beyond me. But do you know that when Earl Warren, you could find this quote, and you probably have it, walked out on the steps after the last Warren report said, "We may not know the truth in our lifetime." And I said, wait a minute, what does he mean by that? There were so many things going on. I don't know whether the Dallas Police Department was in on this thing. You've got Lee Harvey Oswald in your jail. There hasn't been a more important prisoner since John Wilkes Booth. That they didn't cordon off at least a square mile around that. They would cordon off the jail after they got Terry McNichols and the guys in Oklahoma City, that they handled him so cavalierly that a Jack Ruby walks into that garage, all the cameramen are in there. How do you know who those cameramen are? You don't know who those people are. They are treating him like he's some pickpocket they picked up on the street. Now, Ruby kills Oswald. The Dallas police grab Ruby. The next thing I know, I see Ruby in the hallway on television of the police headquarters being interviewed by guys. And I'm saying, wait a minute, you just lost the most important prisoner in the history of the United States, next to maybe John Wilkes Booth. Now you've got the third most direct, because this is the guy who could be your link to what happened. And you're treating him like you picked up some pickpocket on the street. The police work in this town was atrocious. Now, here's what I also can't figure. I can't figure out, if nobody in Washington is involved in this, why a J. Edgar Hoover isn't on the phone saying to the police chief here, I forget his name.
Jesse Curry.
Jesse Curry, saying, "Jesse, for Christ's sake, will you cordon off the police station? Stop leaving these guys out there and let the press come and talk to them. Are you nuts? What kind of police work is that?" Nobody did. Think about this. After Ruby killed Oswald in the garage of the police station, there were reporters in the police station talking to Jack Ruby. And I'm sitting home saying, I don't believe what I'm looking at.
You know Schieffer's story, Bob Schieffer's story.
No, tell me.
This. worked for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram
Yep.
and got the phone call from a lady asking for a ride to Dallas. And it was Marguerite Oswald. And Bob put Marguerite in the car, Lee's mom.
I never knew that.
Drove her over here and then spent the better part of a day and a half at her side because nobody asked, the police never asked who he was. And they assumed he was her lawyer or with her.
I never knew that. Bob never told me
Bob is
that.
coming here on the 21st actually to talk about that. And
I never knew about
he's writing his book. But there was such access to the media. I mean, Ruby, of course, we have all the film footage the Friday night, the night of the assassination, of Ruby standing in the hallway talking to the police guy. I mean, he just walking around with his paper in his arm and just hanging out. Everybody knew him. He was a very familiar character. But the access was just amazing because he was in the midnight press conference correcting the questions that were being asked of Oswald. So he was around the whole weekend. Everybody knew about that. But it's something. I mean, our goal at the museum, and I want to talk about this, but our goal at the museum is to factually tell the story. And so as a result, we don't know who killed John Kennedy. It's up there on the, our exhibit says who done it. We don't know. We lay out some of the major conspiracy theories, but we don't take a position. We're always trying to try to say, walk a middle ground here. But it has been, on occasion we get calls and say, why don't you just tell the truth that Oswald did it? Why don't you just let go of this conceit that somehow there's mystery to it? And in our position, there is mystery to it.
Of course there is. I don't know a news guy in the world who wouldn't give anything to be able to break this story. How this remained all these years. You think about, there's a Watergate connection here. That's the same crowd. Do I know it? No, I don't know it for sure. But am I about 99% sure of it? Yes.
I'll show you a map upstairs. One of the chill elements for me was when I first started working here and researching things. If you draw Oswald was put out at the rooming house in Oak Cliff where he lived.
Yeah, right.
And he started walking, which was south,
right,
down, and he got the intersection Patton and 10th where he shot Officer Tippett.
Right.
If you keep drawing that straight line, because at that point he turns and goes west to the Texas Theater. If you go that straight line, you hit Jack Ruby's apartment. He goes about 10 blocks, halfway to Ruby's apartment if you go straight. Now if you turn, and you turn the other way, you obviously go to the Texas Theater. So it's just, there again, it's one of those moments you go, where was he going? Because obviously you don't walk this far.
That bears out my feeling that the two of them knew each other. I have no doubt.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead and finish your thought.
Well, do I know any more than that? No. I wish I knew more than that. Would I have loved to have been the guy who broke that story? Did I think we had it? The guy who was working with us was the attorney for the Republican senator who said, Nixon said, you don't want to know. Nixon knew a lot. I think Lyndon Johnson knew a lot. I think, well, there are people who think Lady Bird did it. Lyndon Johnson put Allen Dulles on the Warren Commission, I think, to kind of calm the country down. I think they thought, if the truth ever comes out here, we are ripe for a revolution. And I don't think they could take that chance. And I wonder, well, somebody would have turned it, somebody like Michael Beschloss would have turned it up, if there isn't anything in the Lyndon Johnson library that sheds light on what he might have known.
There's a quote upstairs where Johnson in 1971 was interviewed by a monthly magazine. And, he was at that point, the hair was down on his collar and over his ears.
Yeah,
and
right.
In his descent, as it were. He said, I can believe Oswald pulled the trigger, but I'll never believe he acted alone. So Johnson says this in 71, and this kind of, not rumination, but this is what I think. I mean, that clearly Johnson's point of view was the Warren Commission report was important for the very reason you specified. Get it out there, say it was, one guy.
And then later on we can...
We'll sort it out later.
Right.
But
now, is there anything in Connolly's papers?
Nothing substantial in terms of the Connolly and Nellie. I've toured Nellie.
Yeah. Is Nellie still alive?
Nellie's still alive, lives outside of Austin. And I took her through 10 years ago. I had a bruise on my arm for 3 days where she held my arm because of the intensity of it. And she said, we always believed it was something else. We didn't know what it was. But, that Nellie thought it was 3 shots or 4 shots, and there was lots of confusion, certainly. But they were there.
Sure. Now, Nellie, I think Connolly at the time said there was more than 1 shot.
For the House Select Committee, they both said that they thought there was a 4th shot.
Now, somebody, I'm trying to remember who, ran a mock trial in which evidence was given that seemed to stand up that there were shots fired from the grassy knoll. And I'm trying to remember.
Well, the House Select Committee's finding was the probability of 95% there was a shot from the grassy knoll.
Mm-hmm.
That was the finding. Mm-hmm. Then later there was challenge to the acoustic research.
Except that the shots from the grassy knoll, they claim, somebody explained this to me once. They say if there were shots from the grassy knoll, there would have been a bullet not in the back of the head, but in the front of the head. And then somebody raised it. Yeah, suppose the car had already gone past the grassy knoll and the shot went into the back of the head.
It's all trajectory.
Yeah. That's it right out there, right?
That's it. Yeah, you're looking at the street, we'll walk up there.
Street.
And let me
Where's Marilyn?
She's up in the museum. She's touring me. She said, leave me alone. I said, okay. So,
okay.
I taught at this place with Hugh Sidey, Dick Stolly from Life.
Right.
I took Salinger for the walk. I took Moynihan for a walk. Cronkite showed up one morning in February, 4 or 5 years ago, freezing cold, and wanted to tour the museum. We weren't even open, so I took him.
So I remember Walter and I were here right afterwards because we did a lot of filming up in the window.
Walter stood in front of we had the video, of course, where he tells the country, the nation, the president's died, and he cried.
Yeah, he did, absolutely. I was in the control room. I was
the
in
emotion. I mean, what was it like? Because as I talked to all these guys, and not that you're all liberal Democrats, that's not my point, but I think clearly there was a kind of almost adrenaline rush. And then, because when
we're conservative Democrats.
but when they come back to visit, the letdown. I mean, Moynihan cried in the parking lot, but that's a very personal loss. But at the same time, just the, oh my God, this.
But if I read this correctly, Sorensen, Salinger, Kenny O'Donnell, Dave Powers, see, they never came here. They couldn't take
Salinger
it.
finally came in.
He did, but the other.
But I've been trying to get the rest of those, and of course we've lost both of Powers and O'Donnell now. But
they're gone. But
Sorensen
Ted said it is too painful to talk about. Ted and I sat in a hotel room one morning in Chicago. In fact, we went to Chicago for the anniversary of the first Kennedy-Nixon debate, which I produced and directed. And I'll talk about that night too. That night was a lot more significant in America than anybody, maybe but I realized. Big. The worst night in American politics. That's the night, if you want to change the subject.
Sure, go ahead.
That's the night that politicians looked at us and said, that's the only way to campaign. And we looked at them and said, that's a bottomless pit of advertising dollars. Since that night, no one can hold office in the greatest democracy on earth without the money to buy television time. And no one can get the money to buy television time unless they're in bed with a lobbyist. Lobbyists have taken over America. There are more lobbyists on Capitol Hill by far than there are legislators. There are more lobbyists in Austin than there are legislators. You know why? Because nobody there can get reelected without money to buy television time. And then you get nuts like Mitch McConnell who say it is against the First Amendment to deny anyone the right to buy as much television time as he can afford. You know the Founding Fathers would turn over in their graves if they heard that? Buy television time. What has that got to do with the First Amendment? So I've said, okay, you can't outlaw it because of the First Amendment. The First Amendment has never kept you from outlawing obscenities. Declare them obscene. But that night gave birth to the dirtiest word in American politics. You know what it is? Fundraiser. That's all. Every time the president leaves the Oval Office, he's going to a fundraiser. I don't remember Jack Kennedy going to before that, that's touched it off.
When they were planning the trip to Texas, Connolly was the point person in the state, and Connolly, they were trying to plan these events, and Connolly said you can do one fundraiser, but that's all. You can't. It's unseemly for the president to come to the state and try to raise money. So that's why that night in Austin was going to be the one fundraiser.
Yeah.
We've done Houston and San Antonio and Fort Worth and Dallas, but it was going to be unseemly for the president to raise money.
And today, I'll give you an example. You have any idea what it cost Franklin Roosevelt to get elected President of the United States? $2.2 million. In today's money, it's like $26 million. Hillary Clinton and Rick Lazio spent twice that on television commercials to win one Senate seat. It is so out of hand. There is no more democracy when you have to buy television time, and the guy who raised the most money probably gets elected. And it all weaned off that night. Now, I don't think Jack Kennedy or I or anybody else realized what was going to happen, but that is the legacy of the Nixon-Kennedy debate.
Was it? I mean, clearly, there was an attempt not to appear biased. The debate was happening, and
Yeah.
But what was the intrigue in terms of organizing that evening? I know that Nixon comes in and he's moving things around. Like his people are trying to move the desk in front of Howard Case. I mean, what was your sense of the politics of this? Read the book.
No, there's the picture.
Yeah.
That to me is my favorite picture ever.
Fantastic picture. Let me show you. But did you guys, what was your sense? I mean, obviously, I say obviously, the people watching TV believe Kennedy won, people on the radio believe Nixon won. What did you believe?
What did I believe? I'd had a meeting with Kennedy at Midway Airport. Ted Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, Ted Sorensen and I had a meeting at Midway 2 weeks before the debate. He was so curious. Where do I stand? How long can I answer? Can we interrupt each other? I mean, every question in the book. I never met with Nixon before he walked in there that night. Kennedy went home and rested and boned up on everything the afternoon of the debate. Nixon spoke to, it was either the Plumbers or the Carpenters Union. He thought it was just another campaign appearance. He never realized how much was riding on it, which Kennedy understood. I was standing there talking to Nixon when Kennedy sort of walked in. It was like the referee telling the guy sitting in the ring with the two guys. I looked up. There's this guy. He looks like a matinee idol. He's well tanned because he'd been campaigning in California in an open convertible. Well tailored. Harvard. Looks like it's a movie star who's walking into that studio and not a presidential candidate. Nobody ever saw a presidential candidate before who looked like some guy off a college campus who was the best looking guy in that college. And I thought, my God, you know, this is not going to be a fair fight. So I said, do you want makeup? And Kenny said, no. He didn't mean any. There's a PS to that too. And I said to Kennedy, Nixon, would you like some makeup? And he heard Kennedy say no. So he said no. He needed it. He went in the back room, and a guy made him up with something called a shave stick. Looked like the wrath of God. Came out, put him on camera. He looked terrible. I went out and got Frank Stanton, was then president of CBS. And I said, Frank, you better come in here. I think there's trouble brewing here. He looked at him, he said, called in Ted Rogers, who was Nixon's television guy, and said, you satisfied with the way he looks? He said, yeah, we think he looks great. Stanton said to me, then it's none of our business. What are we going to do about it? I said, fine. They claim that, in fact, they're probably right, that debate turned on Who looked the best? Now, was I happy that Kennedy got to be president because of it? Yes. Is there something wrong with the guy getting to be president because he looks better? Yes. That's how you ought to pick Miss America. That's not how you ought to pick your president. But we got the right guy for the wrong reason. Nixon never recovered from that night. There were other debates. He did better, but that first one left an impression on America. They stamped, that's the guy, and no matter what this other guy says, no matter what they do from now on, what they said that night, nobody can remember. They talked to historians. I always say that thing was all about makeup. And the historians who are holier than thou say to me, well, what about what they said about Kimoy and Matsu? And I say, okay, where are Kimoy and Matsu, and who said what? Nobody, they don't know. They know the words. I mean, Kimoy and Matsu, but it was about a guy, one guy, who looked like nobody had ever seen a presidential candidate before, another guy who looked like the run-of-the-mill presidential candidate. Now, I'm telling this story to Ted Sorensen. Actually, we were on the History Channel talking, and we're going outside to get in the cab, and Ted says to me, I'm going to tell you something you never knew. We made up Kennedy in the back room. I said, well, you did a better job than Ted Rogers did. It's strange that one broadcast, not the whole series wasn't what did it. It was that one broadcast that left an indelible stamp on America of a guy who at that point nobody knew and nobody could have cared about. And who is this guy from, this rich kid whose father was kind of a crumb bun? His father was. You know that Tina Sinatra told me, and we put it on the air, that her father, Frank Sinatra, got a call from Joe Kennedy saying we need help in West Virginia, in the West Virginia primary against Hubert Humphrey. What can you do for us? And Kennedy called San Giancana, and they got the unions to back Frank Sinatra. And when it was over, when Bobby started to go after the mob, Giancana called, this is all from Tina Sinatra and her father. Giancana called her father and said, you son of a bitch, we helped this guy. What is Bobby, his brother, doing to us? And Frank said, don't be mad at them, be mad at me. I did it. What do you want? He played 12 or 13 dates free at San Giancana's Villa Venetia nightclub in Chicago to pay back Giancana for his help with Jack Kennedy. Brought the whole Rat Pack. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis, Joey Bishop. They all came and played there for nothing. That was their payback for what they did for Jack Kennedy. When Sinatra tried to get a license for a gambling casino, Cal Neva Lodge, outside of Vegas. It might have been outside of Tahoe, I'm not exactly sure. He was asked about it, and he said it never happened. And Tina said to me, he lied, because it did happen. Now, think about this. We go through this whole Monica Lewinsky thing. Jack Kennedy had San Giancana's girlfriend, Judith Exner, in the White House. I was married to a woman, before I was married to Marilyn, who was one of the women he used to sneak out of the White House to go see in Washington. I mean, he got away with, well, today you couldn't do that, but he got away with an awful lot. And he was a charming rogue. I mean, the charm was, nobody was ever that charming, and he got away with everything. But he was great.
Discretion, though. I mean, it was.
Oh yeah. No, but he knew, he picked and chose what he was doing. I mean, Clinton's problem is not sexual; it's cerebral. I mean, there isn't a guy in the world who isn't smart enough to know that a young kid making it with the President of the United States is going to brag about it. I mean, why is she doing it if she can't brag about it? So somebody's going to find out about it. Jack Kennedy was discreet. He was a rogue. He was everybody's hero, and he got killed.
One more question. I'll
Yes.
take a time.
Yeah.
Look around a little bit while you're here. If you could, and this, I know we're kind of like a broken record, but one thing we're trying to understand better is what went on in this community. It's not a local story necessarily, but there's a local component to it. After the assassination, how did the country and the media view Dallas, Texas?
As with a second-rate police department that screwed up badly, that Dallas was kind of, boo Dallas. I mean, I think they started rooting against Dallas teams. Dallas had stamped on it site of assassination. It's no longer that. I mean, I don't think there's many people around here who even remember all that, but I do remember that and I've got to wonder, was Jesse Curry inept, or was Jesse Curry knew a lot more than, did J. Edgar Hoover know a lot more? That J. Edgar Hoover wasn't on the phone to Jesse Curry saying, hey pal, are you out of your mind? What are you doing there? This guy's running in and out of this place. You didn't cordon off, and there were roadblocks around the place. Which I wonder, did Hoover know a lot more? Did Jesse Curry know a lot more? Or was it just plain inept? I don't know.
We leave anything out? I'm so sorry. I
No,
co-opted your interview.
it's okay.
I'm going to do that.
It's all right.
You didn't have a mic.
No, that's...
He picks up on mine.
But did you get more or less what you wanted?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely.
At the end of these, we always just leave it open. Is there anything we left out, any stories of any interest relating to Kennedy or the assassination that you think we should have on the record here?
No, there's just one amusing story. We were doing a 3-network conversation with Kennedy, and I knew him not well, but through an ex-wife, and I'm down there, and we're setting up in the Oval Office in the morning. He's going to church, and he arrives about 11 o'clock, and walks in, and I said, we're being very careful. We're covering all the furniture. Nobody's going to bang into anything. And we put a drop cloth down to protect the floor. He said, forget the floor. And he went over and he pulled the drop cloth back. He said, you see that? And the whole floor was eaten up. It looked like animals had come in there and eaten up the floor. And I said, what is that? He said, that's the son of a bitch's golf cleats. I knew right away it was Dwight Eisenhower. And he said, you know what that son of a bitch did? He used to wear his golf cleats into the Oval Office, and he'd get up, and he'd go outside to this putting green, and he chewed up the floor. No, that was Jack Kennedy at his best.
You can order a videotaped copy of any of tonight's American Perspectives events by going online to the bottom of cspan.org's homepage and clicking on C-SPAN Store, or call C-SPAN Archives toll-free weekdays at 1-877-ON-C-SPAN. That's 1-877-662-7726.